Thank you for listening to Footnotes, a Fellowship Mosaic podcast. This is a space for us to dig deeper into Scripture, what is happening in our community and culture, and continue the conversations we start on Saturday nights. We are excited to have you join us as we pursue truth, holiness, and redemption together.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Footnotes. My name is Collin, and this is a space where we like to give a little more time to process some of the things regarding the topic we taught on Saturday night in our services, and dive a little deeper into some of the conversations or practices out of that space. And this past Saturday, we're in our fall launch series, and we kicked off with worship together. And then this past Saturday was make disciples together. That every disciple is a disciple maker. You as a follower of Jesus are commissioned and called to actually invite others to follow Jesus. And we left off with a practice in that time being beginning to pray and cultivating the heart of God for those who are not following him. But I wanted to take this time even just to learn from one of the experts on how do we actually do this? Like when it comes to preaching the gospel and telling others the good news of Jesus, whether it's in conversations or through relationships, through models or methods, so much. Where do we begin? So I brought Nick Rowland in because Nick's actually been doing a lot of good reading on this very topic. Hey, Nick.
Hi, Collin. How are you?
Good, man. Hey, when it comes to preaching the gospel, making disciples, evangelism, give us, what are some definitions here? Like, what are we saying when we're talking about those things?
So I come at this question of evangelism not as a gifted evangelist. And so, I compare it to me playing sports growing up. I was never a very talented athlete, but I wanted it really bad. I really wanted to be on the team. And so where I lacked in natural ability, I had to make up for with technique. I had to really pay attention to everything coaches were asking of me. I had to do everything by the book. And when I was doing things as perfectly technically as possible, I was still like a C+, B- compared to the natural athletes. But that was enough. Like that was enough to get to play the game, Mm-hmm. I was never a star. I was never, something somebody wrote home about, but I was able to play the game because I paid attention. And I would say I'm very similar with evangelism. I'm in awe of people like you. I think Matt Newman is this way. People I've gotten to be around who just have this gift with lost people and this ability to connect and to connect the gospel to their lives really well. I don't breathe that naturally, but I'm also convicted that I need to be an evangelist. So for me, I had to go, okay, well, if it doesn't come intuitively to me, then I need to be a learner. And I need to learn from the scriptures. I need to learn from other people who are gifted at what they do. So,
and I love something you just touched on is, there's this gift for evangelists, and it can almost be written off as, I guess I don't have to do that.
Right.
And I love even the posture you're taking of like, no, this is actually something that every follower of Jesus is called to do.
Right.
Whether you have the gifting, the skill, the ability or not. And I'm curious to even hear the learning, because I'm convinced that regardless if you feel gifted at it or not, that actually could become the avenue through which the gospel is presented. But
yeah, no, that's a good point, Collin, because first of all, we wouldn't say that with any other gifting. So certain people are gifted with generosity. That doesn't mean the rest of the church doesn't need to be generous.
Yeah.
Certain people are gifted teachers, and yet everybody, if you're going to be a parent, you need to be able to teach your kids the scriptures. If you're going to be in community, you need to be able to teach one another. So there's a teaching one another, a being generous with one another that is a calling for all of us. Certain people are going to be especially gifted at it. And I think what I see in the New Testament is not so much that only the gifted people do that work, but rather those gifted people teach the rest of us. And so if you're a gifted evangelist, you're going to be sharing the gospel more than the rest of us. You're going to be meeting with lost people more than the rest of us. But hopefully, you're also teaching the rest of the body how to do it. And I think we fall into a bad pattern as a church when we forfeit our God-given calling to only for the superstars to do it. So it's going to be a lot of learning, and I got sidetracked and I already forgot what you asked me. What am I talking about?
Yeah. So books, things you've been reading, for you, that posture of, I don't necessarily feel gifted at this, however, I know I'm called to this. What have you read? Even just some of the principles, things to how do you actually practice this? Like when it comes to sharing my faith with someone who doesn't share my faith. Yeah. What have you learned?
So a formative experience for me was I, in seminary, had to take a class on evangelism with a guy named Dr. Doug Cecil. And Dr. Cecil was really influenced me a lot because the rest of seminary did come intuitively to me. You know, I was great at biblical studies. I was great at theology. I was great at reading and writing. Evangelism was really intimidating because that's not what I do well. And here's a class where the whole class is devoted to that. And in the class, we had a bunch of different assignments, but one of the assignments was to share the gospel with 5 non-believers in the semester, and it was pass-fail. If you don't do it, you fail the class.
Wow.
And so to share the gospel with 5 non-believers in 5 months was going to be one of the highest concentrations of evangelism I've ever done. I'd never done something like you do with the Kaleo where you're sharing regularly day in, day out on the beach. And so that just wasn't part of my experience. So that was really intimidating. And so I was like drinking out of a fire hydrant from Dr. Cecil trying to learn. And he wrote a book called 7 Principles of an Evangelistic Life. And that book has been really important for me in helping me understand, because he really is speaking to the non-specialist. He has a conviction that every believer should embrace an evangelistic lifestyle. And so that's kind of what he's leading people towards. So defining that term evangelism, the word evangelism, the way we use it, that direct word isn't in the New Testament, but a whole bunch of related words are. It comes from the word euangelion. So that's the Greek word that means good news. And so even though there's a word for good news, euangelion, there's also a way you can euangelion somebody. So you can make a verb of it, and you're gospeling someone. You're telling them the good news. So if we were making that like a rough translation to English, it would be something like the evangel, and we evangelize.
So when Paul tells Timothy, preach the gospel, like that would be the...
Possibly. I'd have to go look at that verse. Okay. There's 2 words that you'll see. I would assume that would be the verb of euangelion. There also is a word kerygma, which means preach or proclaim.
Okay.
So I don't know. I'd have to go look at that exact verse. But I would assume if they put the word good news in there, it's probably euangelion. But I'd have to check the translation.
But either way, it's an action, it's a verb, it's something you do to share.
Yeah, it's a verb, and then it is also a noun. Usually when it's used as a noun, it's the content of what we preach, the good news itself. So you have the content, the good news, and then the action, telling people the good news. And so essentially when we talk about evangelizing, what we mean, one dictionary of theology, the Evangelical Dictionary of Theology, says that back that up, evangelism is the proclamation of the good news of salvation in Jesus Christ with a view to bringing about the reconciliation of the sinner to God, the Father, through the regenerating power of the Holy Spirit. I know that's a lot of words. Here's the idea. You are telling the good news of salvation through Jesus with an aim of that person coming to faith by the power of the Spirit. And so those are kind of the 2 halves of it. One, you got to tell them the good news, and in a sense, you're inviting them to believe the good news, to come to know God. And what Dr. Cecil would emphasize is that evangelism is both a point and a process. So it's a process in that a lot of times the process of getting to that conversation where you tell someone the good news of Jesus, there's some relationship building that happens there. Sometimes the relationship building can be as short as 3 minutes. You know, you're having a quick conversation, you hear where somebody is, and you go there really fast. So an example I had of this, I was standing in line at a local coffee shop here in Rogers, and a man came and stood in line behind me, and he said, "Hey, do you come to this place often?" I said, "Yeah, it's really great." And he said, "Oh, I'm new to town." I was like, "Oh, cool. So where are you from?" He told me where he's from. And I said, "Well, what brings you to Northwest Arkansas?" And he said, "I just went through a really nasty divorce, and I needed somewhere to start over." Now, that's something pretty heavy to drop standing in line waiting to get your coffee. Yeah. And I had some time before my next appointment, and I said, "Man, that sounds really heavy. Do you want someone to talk to? You want to talk about it?" And he said, "Yeah, that'd actually be nice." And he and I sat down, and over 30 minutes, he told me his story of his divorce. It was really painful and really hard, and it seemed like he was really open. So in that conversation, I told him about Jesus, and he didn't convert in that moment. He didn't place his faith in Jesus, but he did acknowledge, like, I know I need something in my life, and I know things are hard. And so I don't know where that went with him. Mm-hmm. But that was a moment where the relationship building, because he was so open, took about 30, 40 minutes before I was able to tell them about Jesus. Yeah. Other times, the relationship building can take years. And so that's where a big part of the Holy Spirit comes in, of really being sensitive to where the person you're talking to is, and where are they open to hearing about Jesus. And I'm blanking on who it was, but I heard one speaker on evangelism once say that people will tell you how far they're willing to go. Yeah. You don't have to push through those walls. Like, you're going to meet people that are pretty closed off, and they're very much giving you the signals of, hey, don't push. So be respectful. Yeah. And other people are going to show they're really open. And so we can follow their openness. Mm-hmm. And when people are closed, that just means, okay, it's going to take a little more time to get to know them. Yeah. And when people are open, you go, okay, it looks like they're inviting a conversation. And so you can follow those cues in people.
With I love, truth traveling on relationships. And so being willing not only to have truth, but even the time to learn someone's story. I mean, you hear that regularly around Mosaic as tell us your story. Tell me your story. And the way, when you give people a space and a place to be known, and that becomes truly like in a gardening metaphor in the New Testament, a seed bed for the good news to be sown. And we can't control the heart, we can't control the response, but that I love that it's the verb of we can and are called to tell the good news into those soils. But what Cecil's principles, right? So what were some of the principles in that book, or is there one that stood out to you that would be good for us to start to maybe stew on or think through?
There's a couple of different ideas that come through. One of them is the idea that sin hits us in a lot of different ways, and the gospel addresses all of them. And so one of the things you can do is you can be sensitive to how sin is hitting the person you're talking to. So a lot of us learned one particular way to share the gospel, yes, which is you're guilty and you need forgiveness. Now, that is always true. Everyone is guilty of sin and needs forgiveness. But that doesn't have to be your lead foot. And so sometimes you might talk to somebody who doesn't have a high degree of awareness of their guilt, but they have a high degree of abandonment by their dad. And so maybe the way they've experienced sin and brokenness is that they had a dad who was never there for them. And so maybe the first presentation of the gospel to them might not be you're guilty and need forgiveness. It might be, hey, did you know how you have a father who won't ever abandon you? In fact, he loves you so much that he sent his son to bring you back into the family. Wow. And so Jesus invites you to trust in him and be adopted into a family that'll never let you down. Wow. Now, that's a different way of thinking about the gospel than you're guilty and someone died for your sins. Both are true. And to have a full understanding of the gospel, we're going to need to hear all those different perspectives on it. But being sensitive to where someone's experience of brokenness is in the moment can be really, really helpful in recognizing where the good news is going to hit them at that moment.
I love that. Oftentimes I hear evangelism and a lot of circles, it jumps straight to your model or what's your approach or the method. And I think that is good and we should have it. And whether it's an illustration or a Roman road, I think all of those are so good and absolutely worth putting into your toolkit of how you proclaim the good news of Jesus to all nations. And I love where you're taking us with, hey, those are models and methods, but we're called to really love people and to adapt that model and that method. And so many times I look back on when I have had a really good model or I have had a really good method, and I wish I could have started with the way that Jesus regularly starts with people he encounters throughout the Gospels. And then he sees them and he knows them and he engages them where they're at, and whether it's with however sin has affected that person. Like I love the illustration you just used, whether it's with the pain or a loss of a loved one, or maybe it really is there's behaviors that they know they do not want to live or walk within, but being willing to adapt our model or our method to the person and allowing that to be the way we move forward anything that you'd add?
Yeah, I mean, so as we grow in evangelism, which I would still consider myself like I'm the infant in evangelism. I still feel super clumsy every time. I still want to avoid it every time.
Why? Do you know why?
That's a great question. I think part of it is I'm just super introverted. And so a lot of times evangelistic conversations are coming from starting new friendships. So new friendships are scary to me. Like I feel like I'm expending a lot of energy and that I'm invading someone's space to like strike up a conversation with a stranger. So that already just whatever about my wiring, that's very intimidating for me. And so, I had a situation where I was on a plane recently and I sat down on the plane and it was actually on a trip I was with you. And I was sitting a few rows behind you and I got on the plane completely exhausted and I was just like, I don't want to talk to anyone right now. I would really like 2 hours of silence.
Just get the headphones on.
And I went an hour and 50 minutes of silence. And in the last 10 minutes, the person sitting next to me leaned over and asked me a question about like what I was in town for. And over the course of the next 10 minutes, we ended up swapping phone numbers and he and I have become friends. He actually took all the initiative, but I had been praying, God, I want to meet lost people and bring them into my world. And so there's a couple points to make there, and I'm jumping ahead of our conversation a little bit. So we'll come back to the prayer point in a little bit. But yeah, I would just say it's intimidating to me. It's scary to me. I'm scared of overstepping boundaries. I'm scared of, so I kind of have this, this like really horrible image in my mind of the obnoxious evangelist. And I think part of it's my pride is I want to be cool and I don't want to be that lame Ned Flanders guy. Children of the 90s know Ned Flanders from The Simpsons. So part of it's my pride that I don't want to be the weird religious guy. And so I kind of want to be cool. I want people to think I'm like approachable. And so I fear like sharing the gospel and coming across that way. And at a certain point, like, I have to recognize like for me to put my pride over somebody else's salvation is pretty shockingly arrogant and selfish of me. And I just have to confess that. But that's where I think models actually are helpful. When I think back, just going on with the sports metaphor a little bit, a really great ball player can improv all over the place. They can read the floor. They can do a bunch of things. They can shift and adjust, kind of the way we were talking about in evangelism, like, oh, you read the person and you can adjust really quick. A 5-year-old needs a very simple script. Yes. Dribble here, pass the ball, shoot there. And that you need models when you're learning to have some steps to help you get the courage up to try. Yeah. And so that's where, I'm not going to rip on things like the bridge. The bridge and that's, if you're not familiar, that's an illustration, a model people have used where you're separated by a chasm, you and God, and Jesus is a bridge that connects you by the cross. I'm not going to rip on that. That's a great model, and it helps people have some steps to take to begin to share their faith. The only problem with a model like the bridge or any other is when you start thinking that is God's method of evangelism and anything else isn't evangelism. Yes. That's when a model becomes a problem, is when you become more committed to the model than you are the lost person hearing about Jesus.
And yet the good news is so good that even when that happens, it's still like in New York, you'll regularly see in the subways the kind of bullhorn approach. That is a model, or the signs, you're a sinner, you're going to hell unless Jesus saves you. And it's like, gosh, that is such a blunt, painful way to approach this conversation with no recognition. And yet, men and women come to know Jesus through that model.
And the other thing to recognize is there's cultural differences there. So that, we need to be careful as Americans of labeling certain models as bad. You and I have a friend, I won't throw his name under the bus on the podcast, but we have a friend who's from Asia, and he said his culture is much more direct.
Yes.
And they're much more comfortable with somebody calling something out on a street corner. Yes. And that's how they would interact. So he said Americans are so sensitive. He just says, y'all are always trying to like dance around each other's feelings and making sure you're not being too aggressive or too assertive. And so we need to recognize maybe even some of our prejudices against a model of evangelism might just be cultural. Now, that doesn't mean it's not valuable, because we want to be sensitive.
Yes.
We want to be culturally sensitive. And so, but I think there's also needs to be some humility in me of recognizing these cultural sensitivities. We need to be wise to them in our culture. And if shouting with a bullhorn isn't working well, let's set the bullhorn aside. Yeah. But that doesn't mean all uses of bullhorn are sinful. There might be some context where setting up with a bullhorn and proclaiming the good news of Jesus is a really godly way to tell people about Christ.
That's good. Say, I'm hearing you, Nick and Collin. I'm following Jesus, and I am terrified. Maybe it's an introvert that just doesn't want to put themselves out there, doesn't feel the makeup. I hear a lot of times, I don't want to get it wrong. Like, what if I get it wrong, or I don't share it perfectly? Say any one of those scenarios. I'm listening to you. I hear you. I want this. What would be, Collin said, pray and begin to pray and cultivate God's heart for the people around you that don't know him. Any next step, or if you could push, I like that sports metaphor. If if it's I'm dribbling with this hand, what would be maybe the next step you would encourage that person to?
A couple things. First of all, you are going to get it wrong. It's not what if I get it wrong. Of course you're going to get it wrong. I get it wrong all the time. I say dumb things. I get scared and walk away. I mean, I in one sense, got it wrong on that plane. I avoided talking to somebody who needed to know Jesus for an hour and 50 minutes, and it was him being friendly with me that got us in a relationship. I've preached things that I realized after. I was like, oh, that's not right. I didn't handle that right. And I'm supposed to be a professional at this. So you're going to get it wrong. Okay, so let's get over that. It feels a lot like parenthood. I get it wrong as a parent all the time, but guess what? I'm the only dad Karis has.
Yes.
So I got to pick myself up and try again each day and keep growing and getting a little better. So God has put you in the life of your neighbors and your friends, your coworkers. So of course you're going to get it wrong. Get it wrong with humility and with love. Ask forgiveness when you get it wrong. And do your best to point people to Jesus, because we will get it wrong. Jesus never will. And so if we're pointing people to Jesus, even if we get it wrong, we've still pointed them in the right direction. So yeah, you're going to get it wrong. I have to get over my pride that doesn't want to get it wrong. And just if you're doing it in humility and as a servant, I think that makes swallowing getting it wrong a little easier. And I would come back around to what you said on Saturday. I really do think the first step is to pray and have eyes open. Because I know it's crazy how it happens, Collin. When I'm not praying to meet lost people, and when my eyes aren't open, I go day in, day out without talking to lost people.
Wow.
When I start praying, God, show me somebody that needs to be drawn to you. And I walk out my door and I go through my day looking for those people, they start popping up everywhere. And so I would say start taking the next step of praying, and praying with your eyes open as you go through your day. And be prepared to just start conversations. Take baby steps. And you know what? A really great baby step might just be saying, I go to this church that I really love, and Jesus means a lot to me. That's a great baby step. That's a great step toward telling people about Jesus. And let's just keep growing a little more every day in evangelism. I think it's a good way to go. And you lead me in that. Every time I'm anywhere with you, you're engaging people well. And so that might be my next thing, is observe people who do it well. So I'm always learning by watching you and people like you who do it really well. So a lot of times when I'm with you, I don't know if you've noticed this, I get really quiet and just observe you interacting with people. And because I'm just observing, I'm just watching. What does Collin do? Collin always makes people feel really welcome. Collin makes people feel like they're seen and they matter. And so I'm usually just watching, just taking notes, because I don't do that intuitively. So I'm learning a lot. So be a learner and watch people who are good at it.
That's good. Well, this next weekend, Matt Nates will close with community, and I think truly one of the best hermeneutics, the ways that the world is going to come to know the love of Jesus, is how we love one another in relationships. And so if you're not doing evangelism, I think another great step would also be to get other followers of Jesus around to encourage you in that, and to invite people not just to a decision, but to a journey with other followers of Jesus to walk it with. So Mosaic, we love you. Let's go make disciples well as a congregation this year.